All right, we've spent the last 2 weeks discussing the dissociate mind of Joseph Smith. Dr. William Moraine examines some horrific events that occurred in the childhood of Joseph Smith and suggests these traumatic experiences led the boy to take the trauma and lock it away in an unknown part of his brain, a process that he calls dissociation. The theory is that the stuff locked away in the brain underlies, as a sort of psychic guide, most of what a person thinks and does for the remainder of their life. We've given the example of Stephen King, how he had a horrific experience, which he can't recall, at 4 years old, where his friend was dismembered by a train, how he walked around not knowing that anything had happened, and how he has become a prolific writer of horror. Dr. Moraine suggests that the major themes that come from the childhood trauma of Joseph Smith were swords, especially swords wielded by men, violence, amputation and dismemberment, blood on white cloth, on garments, on sheets, and a sexuality that was tied to imminent danger. We talked about that last week in relation to Joseph Smith taking on so many secret wives, young teenage wives, kept from Emma in a fiery environment of witch hunt, trying to find out if Mormons were really practicing this or not. All these things, plus some others, created a subliminal imagery with which Joseph created his religion. Tonight I'm going to briefly outline supportive evidence for this theory as we complete this examination and move on next week into Brigham Young and into the rest of present-day Mormon history. Now, last week we mentioned that people with dissociated minds will often fall into pale-faced, trance-like states when tapping into these unknown areas of their brains, and we had a number of doctors, present-day doctors, say this is what happens. This is how they look when they go to that part of their life. Historic testimony from the family and friends of Joseph Smith support this. In fact, while translating the Book of Mormon, Emma, Joseph's first wife, said, quote, "One time when he was translating, he suddenly stopped, pale again as a sheet, and said, 'Emma, did Jerusalem have walls around it?' When I answered yes, he replied, 'Oh, I was afraid I had been deceived.'" What is really funny about this story is that when it's told to LDS children and in LDS meeting houses, most people sit there and they say, "Wow, he really must have been a prophet. He really must have been translating." But just think about this. Joseph Smith had read and heard the Bible taught all of his life. There are a minimum of 14 verses in the Bible and key chapters of the Bible that Joseph Smith definitely knew that actually use the term wall of Jerusalem and walls of Jerusalem. And there are even whole stories that are told about rebuilding this wall. I would suggest that here, in order to keep his own wife convinced that he was actually seeing or reading about Jerusalem, he tossed in a little con game. And by asking her, "Emma, were there walls around Jerusalem?" And then she, in a moment of experiencing some educational superiority, responds, "Yes, there were, Joseph." Then he validates the con by stating that what she is saying complies with what he just saw in that hat. This is the material of a con job, plain and simple. I'm not suggesting that Joseph Smith always operated by virtue of a con. Evidence supports that much of what he did came from the dissociated portion of his mind. For example, people always ask and send emails, how did Joseph Smith write the Book of Mormon? This is the grand question. And from what I can tell, it came from a conglomeration of themes he either consciously and or unconsciously incorporated into the text by himself and or with the help of others like his father, Oliver Cowdery, Sidney Rigdon, these other men who had literary skill. The sources of these themes include Ethan Smith's view of the Hebrews. It includes anti-Masonic themes from his day and age. It includes themes of American nationalist positions, which were very popular in the 19th century. It includes themes from his own family, the Smith family, American Indian theories, a vast amount of biblical themes, which he stole and replaced and put in there verbatim, and direct answers to prevalent religious issues made popular by restorationists like Alexander Campbell. But it is the subliminal themes from his dissociated mind that we are discussing tonight. One such theme is that of the father figures in the Book of Mormon. Dr. Moraine suggests that Joseph's ambivalence toward his own father was expressed by his splitting him in two separate characters, both beginning with the letter L at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, Lehi and Laban. In fact, Joseph actually in the Book of Mormon ties Lehi and Laban together through their genealogy that he supposedly sees on these brass plates. Both Lehi and Laban are not really literary characters. They're wooden characters to represent something. Lehi is a man of goodness, a man who does everything right. And Laban represents the ultimate form of evil. In fact, it's Laban's intemperance, it's his drunkenness, which Joseph Smith's own father had a problem with, that ultimately ended the life of Laban when when Nephi went back and killed him, cutting his head off. This decapitation or dismemberment occurs early in the narrative and is carried throughout the Book of Mormon, in addition to much of what Joseph did as a man outside of the Book of Mormon narrative. But it is Laban's sword, symbolic of a knife-wielding doctor who operated on Joseph Jr. as a child, that is then taken into the hands of Nephi, a name that if you look at it in E-P-H-I, and Joseph, J-O-S-E-P-H, J-O-S-E-P-H. They have the same letters both in there. And he said this is just perfect, and it happens throughout subliminal stuff that's coming from the recesses of his mind. Even Nephi, the character that represents Joseph, has a great portion of his name therein. Nephi goes and he takes this sword of Laban, and it's used as a symbol of power in the Book of Mormon narrative, and it's passed on to other Book of Mormon heroic characters throughout to use. It's also passed on mythically or metaphysically to Joseph Smith himself in the latter years of his life. It's also by mistake, or it is not by mistake, that this sword of Laban is wielded by every Book of Mormon hero. The leaving and returning from the seashore of Nephi back to Laban was simply Joseph's need to leave the seashore of his youth and return and face, even decapitate, the drunken father who had wounded him so many years before. In the Book of Mormon, Joseph, through his dissociated genius, was able to return to the Smith home, kill the evil aspects of his father through the character Laban, then return to the good father Lehi, who waited at the sea and led his family to an exodus from their old life into the new. The decapitation of Laban is only the first of the dismemberment theme that is found throughout the Book of Mormon. Moraine suggests that this all is perfectly fitting into Joseph's trauma in the back of his head. When Book of Mormon character Ammon stands up to his evil father in the Book of Mormon, his father extends his arm with a sword to stop Ammon, and what does Ammon do? Quote, smote off his arm, and he could not use it. Ammon, who is like the dismemberment king in the Book of Mormon, then meets a band of ruffians who approach him with clubs. And what does Joseph have Ammon do? Quote, smote off as many of their arms as were lifted against him, and then he went to the king, bearing all the arms he smote off with the sword. Dr. Moraine says this stuff is straight from the post-surgical fantasies a young boy would construct, especially with Oedipal complex. When Book of Mormon Lamanites execute a counterattack, Joseph wrote that they did smite off many of their arms and even, quote, took off scalps with a swing of the sword. Themes of swords, cutting, knives, and bloodletting all originate from Joseph's traumatized mind. It is not by any mistake that Joseph incorporated the Masonic rites of slashing and cutting into his temple ceremonies, or that when first introduced to the endowment, men and women had the mark found in the garment over their knee actually cut into their flesh so that they would have a scar at the same place where Joseph's started. It wasn't until women complained that Joseph realized he could only draw the masses so far into his personally dissociated trauma. The white garment, which used to be ever so symbolically trimmed in red based on Joseph's instructions. Did you know that? The white garments had a trim of red all around the seams. Tie the sheets and the blood of his memories to the experience he had as a kid. Without revealing the words of the temple rites themselves out of a desire not to offend so as to turn people away, there are ample references to the elements of Joseph Smith's childhood trauma once again introduced to the minds and lives of unsuspecting Latter-day Saints who go through the temple. These include, in part, commands to be clean from the blood of generations, to have garments washed from the blood, to have garments made white, clean, and pure, to have arms strong enough to wield swords, for there to be marrow in the bones, which is taken from the Bible, of flaming swords, which are also taken biblically. There was even a time when a preacher would appear in the temple film. I went through the temple film when this happened. And when he's questioned by some apostles in the temple film, he explains to these apostles that Lucifer told him, quote, we should have no more apostles. And if any should come along professing to be an apostle, I should ask them to cut off a leg or cut off an arm and then put it on again just to show that they have come with power. Now, you know, when I went through the temple and I heard that preacher say that the thing that they should do to prove that they're an apostle is to cut off a leg or cut off an arm, as stalwart as I was trying to be, I was like, what is this about? Now I know. The image, use, and power of sword was not only used to exert power by Book of Mormon heroes, but the sword of Laban imagery was passed on to Joseph Smith himself. In a letter to a friend in 1839, an LDS defender, having become a living part of Joseph's dissociated fantasy, wrote regarding the defense of Missouri and said, quote, "Come to Zion and fight for the religion of Jesus. Many a hoary head is engaged here. The prophet," speaking of Joseph Smith, "goes out to the battle as in the days of old. He has the sword of Laban that Nephi took from Laban. Is not this marvelous?" Later in life, Joseph began to literally actually use a sword as an emblem of his power. In the history of the church, B.H. Roberts has Joseph Smith dressed in full military regalia, unsheath his sword at his side, raise it to the heavens. There's a picture of that in downtown Salt Lake, and Joseph Smith cries, "I call God and angels to witness that I have unsheathed my sword with a firm and unalterable determination that this people shall have their legal rights." Finally, as both authors Moraine and Brody point out, Joseph viewed himself in the end as having become an actual sword himself or shaft in the hand of God. In a speech that reveals many of the elements of his ego, characters, fears, dislikes, and dissociated mind combined, Joseph stood at a pulpit in May of 1833 and blasted, "I am like a huge rough stone rolling down from a high mountain, and the only polishing I get is when some corner gets rubbed off by coming in contact with something else, striking with accelerated force against religious bigotry, priestcraft, lawyercraft, doctorcraft, lying editors, suborned judges and jurors." And we'll come back in a second. Let me read that quote to you again, okay? Joseph said in May of 1843, standing in a pulpit, "I am like a huge rough stone rolling down from a high mountain, and the only polishing I get is when some corner gets rubbed off by coming in contact with something else, striking with accelerated force against religious bigotry, priestcraft, lawyercraft, doctorcraft, lying editors, suborned judges and jurors, and the authority of perjured executives, backed by mobs, blasphemers, licentious and corrupt men and women, all hell knocking off a corner here and a corner there. Thus I will become a smooth and polished shaft in the quiver of the Almighty, who will give me dominion over all and every one of them. Interestingly enough, in honor of his 100-year birth, a great polished shaft, 38.5 feet tall, 1 foot for every year of Joseph's life, was erected in 1905 in Sharon, Vermont, Joseph Smith's birthplace. At one time, a sign was posted there which fittingly advertised the memorial to the founder of Mormonism. It said, "Visit Joseph Smith Monument, world's largest polished shaft." Dr. Moraine believes that this is the truest monument to Joseph Smith's life and that he would have loved it.